Hey, third graders, it's Mrs. Linderman. We are going to go back to Miss Agnes. I've missed her. I hope you have too. We're going to talk a little bit today about the central message of these couple chapters that we're going to read and the key details that prove that, right? So we're going to start with chapter 11. It's a little longer. Chapter 12 is quite short. So if you need to take a break and you want to pause the video and come back to listen after you take a little bit of a break, that's totally fine. There's not an activity for you to complete today, but I do want you to pay special attention to the little chart I'm going to show you at the end. All right? So let's get back. We're learning a lot about Miss Agnes and the type of teacher that she is, where they live, the types of things that the kids do during the year. So chapter 11. It says, one day Miss Agnes made a long line on the wall with skinny white paper from Anderson's adding machine. And then she put numbers on that line to show how the years went. The numbers went backward till they got to the 0, and then they went forward. The picture of Robin Hood was at the 1100 number. It could also say 1100. And then, whenever we had history, we'd put up another picture. 1948, that was us today. And 1938 was a war picture. Miss Agnes made a picture of bombs dropping on England for that. And down at the other end, she made a picture of cavemen, and the long ago people, and a picture of Russians coming to Alaska in the 1700 place. I'm making a timeline. It was good to have that line. We would see how long ago things were happening with it. It made my thinking go straight. When that line was almost filled up, we played time machine. We pretended we had a time machine, like that guy in this book Miss Agnes told us about. And we'd pick a time to go back to, and we'd pretend to land in the long ago time. And then we'd tell everyone what we saw when we were there, back in time. Do you remember who's reading the story to us? Who's our narrator? Think about that for a minute. Do you remember? It's Fred. Remember Frederica the girl? That was really fun. Kenny made us laugh and laugh when he talked old-timey like Robin Hood and them. Methinks I see a damsel, and stuff like that. But you had to know what we'd learned to play time machine, because everyone would ask questions and try to trip you up. Miss Agnes never gave us tests. She just had us do things like that made us remember what we learned. So it was really harder than a test, but it didn't seem like it somehow. Sometimes in the middle of anything, she'd turn to one of us and say, name the continents, or what do you call animals without backbones? Any kind of questions she'd ask us from what we'd studied before. It made everything stick in our minds better when we knew she was going to do that any old time. Even the little ones could remember really hard things that way. After school sometimes, I'd go over to Grandpa's and I'd tell him about the stuff we learned in history and science. He really liked me to do that. I asked Miss Agnes if I could have some of that skinny paper, and I made Grandpa one of those timelines too. I couldn't make the pictures on it good, like my teacher, but after I told Grandpa, he knew what they were supposed to be. Grandpa never knew anything about the Romans and people like that. When I made that skirt thing they wear in my picture, he laughed and laughed. He couldn't read hardly anything, but he liked to look at that thing a lot. Grandma kicked up a fuss, though, and said she didn't want that paper thing on her wall, and so Grandpa rolled it up and would look at it when she wasn't there. He would show his friends when they came to visit, and they liked it just as much as he did. Grandpa put the year he was born, 1878, on the line, and his friend Old George put the year we moved from Dolby. The picture about World War I was the one they talked about the most, because I'd written under it what Miss Agnes had put on our timeline. 10 million dead, 21 million wounded. They couldn't get over that. Here they were, trapping and hunting and raising their families, and away on the other side of the world, this thing was happening, and they hardly knew. because there weren't radios then. Grandpa doesn't like to stay in the village so much. He likes to be out in the woods all the time, but he's too old to go by himself. So he and the other men, the old men, sit around together and drink tea and talk about the old times. We like to sit and listen to that, us kids. Grandpa remembers when there were lots and lots of white men in the country, the ones who came to wise men and those places to get gold. Remember, they live in Alaska. The Indians helped lots of them when they got in trouble, like when they were out on the trail and nearly froze. And sometimes those white men helped the Indians too, like when someone got sick, one of those men had the medicine for it. They got along good together, Grandpa says. A lot of people around here have grandpas who were those old miners, but Grandpa still works hard. He sets a net under the river ice in the winter, and he helps Plasker's mom with her fish trap. People give him moose and caribou, but he snares rabbits and ptarmigan to eat. And he and Grandma go to fish camp with us in the summer. What he misses is when he and his father would go way up north to hunt mountain sheep, or caribou and moose. Those were his best times, he says. There weren't any moose or caribou around our village in the old days. They hardly saw them, so they had to travel a long way to get them. He tells us the stories of his mama told him about before there were any white men in the country. His mama and them used to make a sod house, half underground, and they'd live in there in the winter and be just warm. Sod is another word for grass. And they traveled all the time to find meat to eat. No villages then. When they started a school in Allakaket, his mama told him to go to school. She wanted him to learn to read and talk English. She was smart that way, he says. She knew he would need to know that stuff, the way things were changing. And she thought maybe if he went to school, he'd have an easier life than she'd had. He went the first time when he was 12. He says they didn't use paper then, only slates to write on with chalk. He went there for a couple of years, just in the fall before winter camp, so he only got through just the first grade work. That's why he likes to hear all about the stuff he missed in the other grades. One of the best things of all was when Miss Agnes ordered a little microscope for us, and we could look down inside it and see things that lived in the water. That was a thing you could look in forever, even if it made your eyes feel sore and tired. With Miss Agnes, the world got bigger, and then it got smaller. We used to think we were something, but then she told us all the things that were bigger than us, the universe and all that, and then all the things that were smaller, too small to even see. So people were sort of in between, not big or small, just in between. That was a really interesting thing to think about. Jimmy Sam brought in something every day to look at under the microscope. Miss Agnes told him there were much stronger microscopes that could see things even smaller than we could see with our microscope. Jimmy looked really surprised. "Where do they have those microscopes?" he asked. Miss Agnes told him that he could go to college in Fairbanks and study with those powerful microscopes. Jimmy looked like he didn't really believe that, and I didn't really either. People from our village don't go to college. Miss Agnes got kind of mad when we all looked at her like that. Just because he lived in a village all his life didn't mean he couldn't become a scientist or anything else, she said. She started rattling off about this scientist or this artist or this writer who started out in a village like ours and went on to school. We were quite surprised, but Jimmy Sam was something different than surprised. His face was all red, and I could tell he'd made up his mind to do this microscope thing right there when Miss Agnes was talking. In a way, we weren't surprised about Jimmy, how he started to think like that. He was quiet, so quiet, He could be there all day and never say anything unless you asked him a question. He had this way of looking at things very carefully, even little things. He was always taking things apart and putting them back together. Anything he was curious about. He was just a little kid, Grandpa said, when he took apart his dad's inboard motor. His dad got mad that time because he was ready to go set the fish net, and he had to wait for Jimmy to put his engine back together. Jimmy was like that with other stuff, too. Once I saw him looking at a fern under the spruce tree by our school, and he looked at it for a long time, and then he began counting the little leaves. I asked him what he was doing, and he looked at me, surprised, because he didn't know I was there. "They'd just come out, just right," he said. "What?" I said. I didn't know what he was talking about. "Look," he said, "on each row, there's just one more leaf less until it gets to the top. How does the fern know how to do this just right?" I just goggled at him and shrugged. I think that's why Jimmy didn't talk so much, because no one could figure out what he was talking about, just Miss Agnes. Chapter 12. There was a record Miss Agnes used to play for us from where she used to live in England. King's Choir, it was called. These people were singing in a big, big church made of stone, so their voices would echo like when we yelled down at the bluff. When she played that record, she looked far away again. We could see she was homesick for that place. "My father was a teacher there before he died," she told us. "In a church?" we asked. "No, at the college there, Cambridge." "Did he teach kids like us?" "No, he taught mathematics to older college students." This church is there, right next to where he taught. I used to go there to listen to them sing when I was a child. She'll be happy to be back in England. After Robin Hood, Miss Agnes read us Greek myths. Boy, those were something. To think of all the mischief those old-time people could get up to, changing into trees and that. We loved the monster ones, and we drew pictures of the chimera and the hydra and the three-headed dog. That was a good one. And after that, she read us the story about Ulysses, and that had more monsters. There was this one with just one big eye. I forget what you call him. After that, she read us all the fairy tales in the big red book. Those were kind of like the stories old Miss Toby and Grandma would tell us at night up at fish camp. Those old stories about Raven and people who turn into animals and all that. We told Miss Agnes about those stories, and after that, Miss Agnes would read us a fairy tale. And then we would tell her one of the old-time stories. Miss Toby told them in Indian, so they sounded different when you tried to tell them in English. Not so good somehow. But that was fun, those fairy tales. My best was Snow White, and Bertha's too. We liked to think about all those funny little men. So remember, I asked you to be thinking about central message and key details of a story. So I made this chart, right? What is the central message of this story, and how do we know? What's the proof? So thinking back, not to the whole story, right? Just to the couple chapters that we read, mostly the first one because it was pretty long, right? What are some things we notice from that very first chapter? Okay, talking all about that timeline, how Miss Agnes took that tape from an adding machine, kind of like a long, skinny white tape about this wide, and she made a timeline, and she drew pictures on it, right, so that they knew when things happened in history. Right? She read things to them. She talked a little bit about the microscope that Jimmy Sam was really interested in and how he could see things. And then she shared that Jimmy Sam could go to college, right? He was very curious. He knew a lot of things, and he could learn more. And then she kind of told them a little bit about people that lived in villages just like they do, right? That went on to be writers and went on to be mathematicians and had important things to do and learn because they went to college. He could be a scientist. They were not used to hearing about anything outside of where they lived. But she talked to them about little things like under a microscope and really big things like the whole world, the universe. Right? So what do you notice that Miss Agnes is doing? Right? These are the things that she did. Right? She got a microscope, she explained it, the parts of it and how it works and things like that. She explained that the universe is a place that's bigger than where they live, right? And there's all kinds of things out there and planets and stars. She shared examples of famous people that were from small villages like theirs. And she was able to show the kids and Jimmy Sam, right, that they can go to college and do the things like these famous people did too. So, what do you think? If these are details about that chapter, what do you think kind of the main idea, the central message of this chapter is? What is Miss Agnes really doing by creating that timeline on that white tape, right? And showing them pictures and drawing pictures of that, right? I think she's trying to get them excited about learning, right? And it's showing how she does that by doing all these things and lots of other things. So I wrote down that Miss Agnes develops their curiosity. She gets them thinking and curious about things so that they want to learn more. Did you also notice how she would kind of quiz them on things, even if they weren't learning about it anymore, so that they would remember it? It just becomes a part of them. Just like when you practice your math facts for multiplication and division, right? The more you practice, the more it just becomes something you know. It's not something you need to learn anymore. It's just a part of you. All right. So thinking about Miss Agnes and central messages and stories, it's kind of what's the big idea and what's the proof that shows us that or that proves that.